more appropriate room in which to be discussing the social value of enterprises. And we've had a pretty brutal lesson to what happens when you don't take proper account of systemic risks. And I think one of the important things to set this conversation in a wider conversation, when the debate about corporate social responsibility started round about the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, it was society asking a question of business. And it was saying, it's not enough that what you do is legal and profitable, it's also got to be socially and environmentally responsible. And there has been a tremendous response from the business world to that. As all responses are, it's not perfect, it's patchy in places, but there has been a pretty massive effort by business to respond to that ask. I think where we are as we go further into the 21st century is a kind of interesting shift as you look at the pressures of success and business success in the 21st century and all of those wonderful curves going up as the emerging middle class begin to consume. We're beginning to see a world in which the risk curves are going up as well, and we're not paying anything like as much attention to those curves as we are to the opportunity curves. And I think we need to go beyond responsibility to be thinking about risk. And that leads me to a lot more about risk, and that leads me very much to focus on what does business now need to ask of society, because business is not going to be able to manage all of those risks itself. And there's a lot of concern and anxiety growing in business that you can no longer rely on governments to take care of those basic risks: food security, water security, energy security, climate security. And if business is going to ask something of society and ask of governments that it does more to maintain the stability that's necessary for investment, it's not going to be credible if it's not doing a bit more than just what's legal and profitable and actually going much deeper down the course that this whole evening is about, and that is demonstrating that there's a net positive impact from businesses, net positive social value from having businesses succeed. So I think there's a broader context to the discussion than simply producing, as it were, better operational resilience. It's also about how we better handle a world of systemic risks. So I see net positive impact, or net positive, as a really central movement in equipping business to be able to have a better and more mature dialogue with society, with governments and with others about what we all need to do to maintain the stability in which investment can take place. It was nice of Ian to give Rio Tinto credit for coming up with the phrase net of positive impact, or net positive. We didn't do it because we were particularly clever. We did it because we were driven by core business needs to come up with that. Fortunately, we're not a retail business, so it never occurred to anybody in Rio Tinto to brand that phrase. So it's now available for all of this. But Rio Tinto's business strategy is centered around becoming a preferred partner, whether with governments or with communities, with customers. Preferred partner is central to the articulation of the strategy, and it was very clear very early on, given the nature of our business, that you weren't going to be a preferred partner if you couldn't show that you were a responsible manager of the world's resources. We have 110 operations around the world. They occupy about 43,000 square kilometers of land. It's the size of the Netherlands, to put that into perspective. But mining actually only takes place in about 10% of that space that we actually, as it were, have rights to. And that's what, in a way, presented the extraordinary idea, and that's where came the idea that we could demonstrate our value as a preferred partner by doing more than simply behaving responsibly on that 10%, but by actually being a much more aggressive in driving out to demonstrate that we would deliver net positive impact. And that was where the phrase came from. We had to do more. Part of it out of fear that if we weren't showing that we were managing that impact and that biodiversity well, it would be taken away from us as pressure on land increased. So there was a core business driver for coming up with that. We came up with the idea a long time before we knew what it meant and before we knew how did you do that. There was a recognition that it had to be done. We then quite consciously avoided the classic corporate mistake, the classic 20th century corporate mistake, which was to commission some extremely distinguished and well-known scientists to go away and write a 4-volume report of how you did net positive impact, and then tell the world you'd solved the problem, and wonder why on earth they didn't take your word for it. So we set out from the beginning to develop our approach to net positive impact by forming partnerships predominantly with conservation NGOs, Conservation International, Fauna and Flora International, Earthwatch, about half a dozen or so, which we set out to help us do the thinking. We shared from the very beginning the idea that this idea had to be developed transparently. So that's what we did. And that took really from the end of the 20th century, really to 2004, when we announced the public commitment. And those of you, as you all do, working in businesses know, there was not a straightforward and smooth path of internal conversation to get to the point where we would make a public commitment to achieving, on biodiversity anyway, a net positive impact, even though we still didn't know what the right metric set was for doing that. And we decided to make that announcement at the IUCN Quadriennial Convention in Bangkok. And it was kind of interesting thing about how we'd actually developed enough trust that we could actually go there to make that announcement, because it wasn't a meeting that was accustomed to having multinational corporations of any kind, let alone the extractive industries, turn up. And there was quite a lot of internal debate in IUCN and controversy about the fact that we'd come along to do that. It's really interesting in the sense of results. By the time we got round in 2008 to the next follow-up meeting in Barcelona, which we'd spent most of that period developing the methodologies and the tools, doing it because we had to do that with internal partners as well as external partners. By the time we came round to doing that in Barcelona, people thought it was completely natural that there should be a mining company sitting down in a meeting of conservationists. So that was the kind of story of how we got there and why we got there. We're now driving that through because, as you all know, it's one thing to have the leadership sign up to something. It's another thing to actually get the businesses to take ownership of the ideas and to really make them work. And we've done that by working forward. The first step was to set out early on a biodiversity strategy. What we're now doing is requiring in all of those sites where we are in high conservation areas, we're requiring them to develop a biodiversity action plan. There remains the key question about how do you actually get anybody to trust you. And what we've done on that score is work with IUCN to come up with a verification process, a protocol, so that it's an independent protocol. We're just beginning to test that in our businesses to see that that's a workable thing. So it is stage by stage in the sort of way Ian was talking about that you have to do this. And you go back to what Ronald Reagan said, if the asset you're building as you do and take forward net positive is a trust asset, then as Ronald Reagan once said about strategic arms, trust but verify. You have to deal with the verification piece as much as you have to deal with the actual operational piece, the piece of doing it. Thank you.